Hi friends, I'm back with Jeff Cranford, and we have been talking about this idea of nostalgia, the goods and the bads, and mostly bad so far is what it seems like, because we have this calling that's out there for us. Sometimes it's in the form of a promise, sometimes it's just in the form of counsel that's directed us in a certain path, and obviously then there's Scripture. We're following where Scripture would guide us. And we get caught up in things that would get us off track. And normally we think of those things in terms of, well, sin gets us off track, or someone who, gives us another assignment gets us. But we're talking about getting ourselves off track by getting caught up in memories that do not serve us well. I'm thinking particularly, say, of the Israelites as they came out of Egypt, headed toward a promise. And they got sidetracked by, well, things aren't quite what we thought they would be on the way to this promise. It was better back then. How do you see that?
Which it clearly was not.
Well, no, like we said, they were enslaved. They had these things going on. So we referenced this before, but now as we kind of unpack that, we say, wait a minute, I have that problem. I can fall into thinking, well, that was better. That was more comfortable, certainly. That was an occasion that I remember fondly, and we stop going. And that's where you led us last time in Philippians 3. If I do not forget those things and keep going, I'm in trouble, aren't I?
And why don't people want that? I mean, you can see that. I mean, you can see somebody, there's an analogy. You see people that are afraid to leave their house because they're terrified of the events outside of their house. So they stay in their house day and night, miserable, horrific kind of an encounter, no relationships, minimal contact, but they're afraid to leave because at least relative to the fears of calling, relative to the faith that needs to be implemented to accomplish what God has called us to do, it feels more comfortable just to be there and live in some ways in the past. And so there's I
understand that. Yeah. I totally understand that. And I think that when you look back at, let's take it to the golf context. I can get caught up in the middle of a round of saying, I played so well yesterday, and I forget. What gets shedded is all the stuff that was not good yesterday.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Because the number added up right.
Absolutely.
And actually today, things may be going better, but the number's not adding up. I mean, we've had that happen all the time. I struck it so well today, and it just seemed like every place I missed was awful.
Sure.
Yesterday I missed 40 yards wide, and it was fine, and I could get up and down, and I could, and all of that stuff. And so we read things very poorly through our own eyes, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And, this idea of just the choking of what God has called us to do, I think, is the critical part to understand about nostalgia. That's one of the things that we find in the great Hall of Faith passage in Hebrews chapter 11. Abraham, these other amazing patriarchs and matriarchs, they were looking, and think about where Paul really gets into the Jewish community in Hebrews chapter 11, the Messianic Jewish community. Says, look, they weren't thinking about where they had come out. They were thinking about the country that they were being called to.
Awesome.
That took faith. It took faith to leave his city. It took faith to go into a place that God would show him. All those things require faith. And so at times it's so much easier just to become that person that just lives in the comfort of a selective memory in the past, and we don't have to face the future. And yet all of us as believers with Jesus is on the move. Jesus is not standing still. Yeah. I don't care if you're 70 or 80 or 90 or 100 years old. Think about Moses was 80 years old when he was called to go back and confront Pharaoh. That was really kind of the seminal moment in his life. That Moses' calling didn't really start till he was 80. You see the same thing in the parable in Matthew chapter 20. Some are called in the 11th hour. It's a powerful calling to go into the vineyard. And yet if they're thinking about where they've come out of, or they're thinking about the past, or they're thinking, oh, it was so much better in the 50s. Oh, if we could just go back to the 60s with the love movement, we could all sit around and flowers and put flowers in our hair and Woodstock and all that. Wherever a lot of those formative years are, if we feel called to go back, we will find ourselves crippled going forward.
There's a lot still to unpack
There
here. I'm very I've got some things going through my mind that I want to talk to you about, because this topic is right where, it's funny to say this because we're using the expression, it's right where we live. And the sad thing is, we're living in the past
I want to talk about
instead
that
of
on the
being
next
right
one.
where we live.
Exactly.
Yeah.